I began to investigate and I began to interview serial killers and I began to interview the news media and law enforcement. And all of this culminated in my book, Why We Love Serial Killers, which is at once an examination of the thought process, the motivations, the dark side of the serial killers themselves, but it's also at very much turning the mirror around and an examination of us, the public, and our fascination with these terrible individuals.
Woo, welcome. You have now entered Mad Warfare, mutually assured distraction, where we explore the weird, terrifying, and sometimes hilarious ways war is fought today, and how we can all protect our minds before we go too mad to find them.
Oh my!
Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern.
Okay, you talk if you haven't got a brain.
Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern.
Are you addicted to celebrity monsters like serial killers or true crime villains? What up, true crime fans? These might be the most successful influencers in America, after all, not because they sell supplements and protein powders on podcasts, but because they sell a feeling, fear, with a plot. And once your brain gets hooked on fear with a plot, it will binge it. It will share it. It will start seeing the world through it. Today we're talking about how celebrity monsters get manufactured and what true crime reveals about how attention gets captured and steered. Welcome back to Mad Warfare. I'm Jocelyn Brady.
And after a happy new year, I'm a happily new Sean Guillory.
Our guest today is a criminologist, TV analyst, speaker, and author of the best-selling Why We Love Serial Killers. He's here to help us understand why we can't look away from the darkness, how celebrity monsters are made, and what all of this reveals about attention, fear, and influence. Please welcome Dr. Scott Bonn.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me on today.
You literally wrote a book explaining why we're fascinated by serial killers. So first question, are you okay? And second question, are we?
Am I okay? You mean mentally? Am I all there? But no, I think, the fascination with things that are larger than life and deadly, I think is a very common thing. It's a very natural thing. To the extent that anything becomes an obsession, it's not healthy. And there are people who become obsessed with true crime, go down the rabbit hole, become obsessed with serial killers, even become followers and groupies of such individuals. So there are extreme cases. But the fascination with true crime, I mean, it goes back as far as at least mass media will allow us to track it. I mean, Jack the Ripper in the 1880s in London is probably the granddaddy of all whodunits and the granddaddy of all serial killer cases and the fascination. And that one is enduring because it's never really been definitively solved. So I've had a fascination with the dark side, with things that are larger than life and scary, even monster movies, ever since I was a kid. And I think it's a very natural thing. And we are drawn, I believe, to the fear generally and drawn to the things that could be deadly to us. Partially, I think, to exercise that fear, to face it and to try to exercise it so that we can sleep better at night. And that's part of the attraction to true crime, I think. So that's a sort of a wide-ranging introductory answer to your question.
And also, so I have this in common with you, worked in advertising and media. And I'm curious did you notice monstrous behavior there? And did that lead you down this path of investigating further? Or were you already looking into serial killers and white collar criminals and all of that?
Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest in Cleveland, Ohio. And ever since I was a child, I was always fascinated by human behavior and motivations and decision making. And so on the one hand, I was drawn to media and advertising, why people might drink Coca-Cola versus Pepsi. And I knew it had to do with the communications, the advertising propaganda, if you will. But I was also interested in the dark side. Why did the Jeffrey Dahmers and the Ted Bundys do what they do? Now, these two areas of interest, while they're related, they're not necessarily compatible. So when I went off to college, Kent State University there in Ohio, I had to make a decision. What am I going to major in? Well, my parents said there's more money in business. So they pushed me to go into marketing and advertising, which I did. But I minored in criminology because I had such a passion for it. And after I graduated, I've always been sort of a goal-oriented individual. I said, they do the best advertising in New York. That's where I'm going. And I did. And I had a career there for about 22 years, steadily rising in responsibility and positions of authority. And ultimately, in the 90s, I was vice president of marketing at NBC Television Network, involved with the news operation there. And in the 90s, there were these high-profile cases, the Menendez brothers and Jeffrey Dahmer and the O.J. Simpson and the Gianni Versace murder. And what I noticed is the perpetrator or alleged perpetrator in these cases became what I later called celebrity monsters. And the public seemed to become fixated with them, even though they were allegedly very diabolical and dangerous individuals. And they eclipsed the story themselves and even the victims, which didn't seem right to me from a morality standpoint. But nevertheless, the Jeffrey Dahmer became a brand name. So it occurred to me as these individuals, the Dahmers, the O.J. Simpsons, the Menendez brothers, who were doing these horrible acts and really eclipsing the victims and the plight of the victims themselves, while that was fascinating from a sociological standpoint, it also seemed very wrong from a moralistic standpoint. And it was something that really got my attention and drew me into it. I wanted to understand in much greater detail. And shortly thereafter, in 2001, of course, was the tragedy of 9/11, and the business world really went south after that. And so I said, this is a great opportunity to go and pursue my other passion, which is justice studies and criminology. So I left the business world for about 6 years, got a master's degree in criminal justice, and then I had the opportunity to do a PhD down at the University of Miami in Florida, which I did. And then things went full circle because I was offered a tenure track job to return to New York as a professor, and I began teaching criminology and even communication studies through sociology, and I began to focus on these celebrity monsters. I said, now's really my opportunity. I'm a college professor. I've got the skills to do this research. And I did. I began to investigate, and I began to interview serial killers, and I began to interview the news media and law enforcement. And all of this culminated in my book, Why We Love Serial Killers, which is at once an examination of the thought process, the motivations, the dark side of the serial killers themselves, their thinking, their motivations, but it's also at very much turning the mirror around and an examination of us, the public, and our fascination with these terrible individuals, because there is, and that's what we're discussing here today, this intense fascination with the dark side, and why we're compelled to look at the flame, why we're compelled to look at the train wreck, as so many people are. So I really brought it full circle, from the business side, advertising side, to criminology, and now examining the interest in all these things. And I even do a stage show. I do a one-man show that I'm touring the country with. I've done it in about 65 cities now, with another 26 coming up later this year, where I talk about my experiences, my research, my conversations with individuals like the son of Sam, infamous serial killer, Dennis Rader, the BTK strangler. And so it allows me to get really right up and personal with the true crime audience, who are fascinated by all things that go bump in the night.
Absolutely phenomenal and fascinating. One thing could be helpful, which earlier you did mention, that fascination in terms of Britain with Jack the Ripper, the Beatles before the Beatles, so to speak. Do you notice that a lot of this fascination with celebrity monsters, do you see stronger in the U.S., or do you see it in terms of internationally? Is there some where no, we absolutely shun, and please, we don't want anything to do with these folks, versus other kind of folks that like other kind of cultures where you kind of see that similar fascination you see in the U.S. and any kind of trends you see across those cultures, we'd love to hear it as well.
I mean, it certainly, it goes without saying that it exists here in the United States. And it does seem to be somewhat of a Western phenomenon. And so in England, I have a number of colleagues in England, and the fascination with detective stories and true crime and these celebrity monsters, it's at least as intense in the UK as it is here. Perhaps even more so. But in contrast, my wife was born in China, and she's lived in the United States now for approximately 8 years. And she, although she's very fluent in English, she just doesn't get it. She said this would never happen in China. There would never be a discussion or in any sort of glorification of these types of individuals in China. But part of that goes also with the communist regime, where the government there is very unlikely to admit any sort of or admit to any deficiencies in the system. So kind of if you ask people in authoritative positions in China what the crime rate is, they'll say, oh, there is no crime in China. We don't have murder, we don't have suicide, we don't have drug addiction, we don't have any of that, which is of course BS. So some of it is cultural, but some of it is also the political regime there as well. But to answer your question, I definitely see this intense interest in other Western countries where I have colleagues.
I'm curious, as you've talked about it being a catharsis for fear, or I think of narrative itself, right? Is like you could practice future scenarios, so letting your brain explore in a kind of safe way. So yeah, can you talk more about that? And I'm curious about cultures who don't have, what is their outlet if they don't have catharsis for fear?
To answer your question about what I mean by that is, if you think about the standard format of the true crime shows, and of course now you've got the ubiquitous 24/7 channels like Investigation Discovery, HLN, Oxygen, that are just true crime all the time. But going back even to, say, the 1980s, and what I like to call the OG true crime shows like 48 Hours, 2020, Dateline, America's Most Wanted, that really happened in the 1980s, which, by the way, it's interesting, that was also the peak in terms of the proliferation of serial killers in the United States. If the serial killers had a peak, it was in the 1980s, and that's also when these true crime shows came out. Well, back to my point. If you look at the standard format, the template of these true crime shows, 48 Hours, 2020, it's like this little morality play that lasts usually 60 minutes, sometimes 120 minutes. But initially, someone is abducted, and it's usually a woman, or she's murdered. And then they take you on this twisting, turning tale of trying to apprehend the perpetrator, and you go all kinds of false starts, and you go down the wrong roads, but ultimately, as you get to the top of the hour after several lucrative commercial breaks, guess what? We ultimately find the perpetrator. Truth and justice prevails. We have closure. We're told the world is safe again. And by the way, we've sold a lot of widgets and products along the way throughout the hour. So I call them they're these lucrative little morality plays. And I know the folks who do the programming at a number of these networks, and they tell me that the goal is to make the individual, and it's usually women. By the way, true crime, 75% of the true crime audience is women. And they know that, and they want to initially scare the bejesus out of the audience, but then by the end of the hour, they once again want closure. They want the audience to feel safe. Truth, justice, and the American way has prevailed, and we also walk all the way to the bank, with significant advertising revenue. So I'm being a little facetious here, I'm being a little cynical perhaps, but essentially that is the way it works. That's the way it works, and it's done with intention. It's done knowingly, and like I said, it does work. So, but they recognize they don't, I don't know about you, but I think people and myself included, I don't like ambiguity. I don't like to be left hanging. It's very uncomfortable. And so that's why these morality plays, more often than not, there is closure at the end of the hour.
It's a great time to sell pepper
Yeah,
spray
well,
and designer
absolutely.
purses.
Absolutely. By the way,
So-
did you know that there are Louis Vuitton body bags? Yeah. It's to,
No.
it's to send yourself
What?
off in style. But
The price is right.
But I'm not
Yeah.
I'm not making this up. There really are.
That's amazing. You talked about some of the heyday being kind of like in terms of the 80s, even 90s. Do you actually feel like there may be like a decrease nowadays in terms
The number
of
of serial killers?
Just because
You mean
it-
the number of serial killers?
Well, no, in terms of like like folks really interested. And the thing that seems to be interesting, please correct me if you think I'm wrong on this. You talked about like the resolution and folks not wanting to be in ambiguity was a lot of the pull for kind of some of these shows. It seems like nowadays when there is this kind of like big mass spree crime or assassination, the ambiguity in terms of the chase and finding who this is, that seems what a lot of the pull, at least in this internet, social media age, seems to be. And once it's kind of resolved, not that people don't really care anymore, but it seems like a lot of the interest now is in the chase. But I don't know if you would agree
No,
with that or
I do
not.
agree with it, but it's very consistent with what I'm saying. Is that people crave closure? They want closure, and the media now, podcasts, this proliferation, 24/7 access to news, the latest information on a case, allows the people who are so inclined to go down a rabbit hole, to literally embed themselves. And some people literally do embed themselves in the cases. They become these web sleuths and become totally obsessed with a particular case. And once it's resolved, then move on. So part of this phenomenon, this web sleuthing phenomenon, and this never-ending hunger for more content and more information is driven by the media itself and the technology that allows it. My grandfather, if he was alive, bless his soul, he would be about 110 years old now. But back in the 1950s, he was a true crime junkie, but all they had were these pulp magazines back in those days, True Crime Uncensored, with this scantily clad woman on the front cover, and it was, considered very lowbrow entertainment, and people didn't really talk about it much, but, he'd drink a few beers and then read his magazines. Well, it's all come out of the closet now. It's high production values. It's mainstream, on every network, every streaming platform, and it's just become, truly part of our popular culture. I think it is really media, that the technology itself, the availability of constant information, constant updates, as well as high production values, that is feeding the machine. It's always been there. The hunger has always been there. It's just now we can just feed that never-ending hunger. So I don't necessarily, and it's also become more acceptable. It's become more socially acceptable because of the high production values, because of very established people. Like you now notice very established content creators like Dick Wolf, who did so many of the well-known primetime TV shows that are beloved by the American public. He's now involved in true crime. So when you get individuals like that who have tremendous credibility and acceptance by the American public, when you get them involved, it just lends more credibility and more acceptance, to this sort of thing. So true crime is here to stay, without a doubt. I don't necessarily think that the interest is inherently stronger. It's just now we're feeding it. We're bringing it out, and it's more socially acceptable. But I should say, at the same time, and even though you didn't ask this question, most people don't realize this,
Okay.
but serial killers are dramatically on the decline in the United States. Not surprisingly, the 1980s was the high watermark for the number of serial killers in the United States. During that decade, 1980s, there were approximately 800 serial killers on the loose that have been documented. Today, all these decades later, it's been consistently dropping. This decade, approximately 35 serial killers have been identified in the United States. So it's been a dramatic drop off, which begs the question, what happened to them? Where did they go? Did they move to Greenland? And if so, why do we want to buy it? Why do we want Greenland?
Is it the hunger for being a serial
No.
killer has dropped, or is it harder to be one now because of all the
Bingo.
technology? Is that mostly
It's the latter, along with a couple of other things. First, no. The forces of nature and nurture, which we could talk more about if you want to, that lead one to become a serial killer in the first place, the biological as well as cultural phenomenon that lead one to become a serial killer, I do not believe they've left the human condition, but we have gotten much better at identifying and apprehending. And there's several things involved in that. One is big tip of the hat to those FBI profilers, friends of mine, who developed these new tools and techniques back in the early 1970s. Up until 1973, they didn't even call them serial killers. They called them mass murderers because they didn't understand, and they lumped them together with mass shooters. But then Roy Hazelwood, who is a very dear friend of mine, sadly passed away a few years ago. John Douglas, Bob Ressler, Ann Burgess, they're the sort of the Mount Rushmore quadrant of profilers. They developed these new techniques, and guess what? When you have techniques that are effective, you find a lot of what you're looking for, and that's exactly what happened back in the 1980s in particular. And I firmly believe that many serial killers prior to the 1980s went unidentified as such, simply because they didn't have the skill and the technique to connect the crime scenes, to connect the dots. And if you've got 8 separate murders and you don't realize that there's a serial killer responsible for all of them, you're going to treat them as 8 separate murders. And I believe that's exactly what happened before they developed this new sophistication. So that's one thing. Another thing is, in the 1980s, new science, and in particular DNA, came along in 1986, and it changed everything. It allowed many so-called cold cases to be solved. For example, the Golden State Killer that had terrified California and baffled law enforcement for decades. This old man, Joseph D'Angelo, an octogenarian, he had been at it so long and dormant, he probably even forgot he was a serial killer. They ultimately got him through, get this, Ancestry.com. That's how they got him. They linked him to his relatives through Ancestry.com. So DNA was a big game changer. And then finally, another attributing factor, I believe, is what we've been talking about, which is this nonstop true crime and infotainment, information entertainment, like 48 Hours 2020 Dateline. Because before the 1980s, there was nothing like that out there. Along come these shows in prime time that scared the living shit out of us, but they also taught us to be vigilant, to be wary of strangers, to identify potential risks, get lights, get security, and whatever you do, don't go hitchhiking across the country with Ted Bundy, because it's not going to end well, So I believe that these primetime shows that evolved later into the podcast and so forth have served a real value. So the bottom line is it's simply much more difficult to be a successful, prolific serial killer now than it was prior to the 1980s. And I believe that many a serial killer, fledgling, wannabe, down the road serial killer, is being apprehended after their first murder and before they even have an opportunity to become a serial killer. And I think a very good example of that, for anyone who's following these cases, is Brian Kohberger, who is now cooling his heels in prison after a quadruple murder of the 4 students in Idaho. I've been very involved in looking into his progression, his background, and I believe that he was a serial killer in the making.
What makes someone want to do it serially? What is it? What drives, and also I just want to have a moment of grief for anybody who is aspiring to be a serial killer born after the 80s. Your time is up. But what is the, what is it just a complex combination of nature and nurture, and how do you notice it? How do you spot it?
Yeah.
Like this Kilberger case.
So one of the great myths, and there's a number of myths about serial killers that are common misunderstandings among the public. And if you want to learn a lot more about that, I mean, read my book, Why We Love Serial Killers, or come to one of my shows, because I spent a lot of time talking about it. But one of the great myths is that they're all clinically mentally ill. And that's just not the case. At least 80% of all serial killers are not clinically mentally ill because they fall into a category of either psychopath or sociopath. And those two conditions, according to the American Psychiatric Association, and I definitely agree with it, are not mental illnesses. They're antisocial personality disorders for which there is no treatment or cure. And in particular, psychopaths are born that way. The psychopath is a force of nature. They are born with a brain that is simply hardwired differently to experience the world, to process stimuli, data, information differently than the normal brain. And the frontal lobe of the brain is where impulse control is regulated. Guess what? In the mind of the psychopath, it's dead. There's nothing there. There is no impulse control. There are no guardrails. There are no brakes. When they want to do something, they just do it. And empathy, the thing that allows us to feel the pain of others, to truly identify with another living thing, they can't do it. They are incapable of it. I like to use the analogy of an electric appliance like a hairdryer. If you pull the plug out of the wall, you got a useless hairdryer. Well, guess what? When it comes to empathy, empathetic connection with other living things, the psychopath is unplugged. They're like that appliance that just doesn't work, which is why they can hurt people with impunity when they are so inclined. Now, sociopaths are a function of nurture. They're born with a brain that is normal, that does have impulse control, that can feel empathy and connection with others. But these individuals suffer tremendous abuse, trauma, neglect, torture themselves, and they become trained to become predators themselves, usually to protect themselves, and then later act out as predators and kill others for their own amusement. Not everyone who suffers abuse, of course, as a child becomes a sociopath, but some do. And these individuals are like the appliance that is unpredictable. Everyone hates the appliance. You plug it in and it works, but then it short circuits and it doesn't work right. That's a sociopath. A sociopath is prone to all kinds of mood swings and bouts of rage and anger because their emotions that they do have are all over the place. If anything, a sociopath is much easier to identify when you're confronted with one. Even though psychopaths and sociopaths share that very low impulse control and lack of empathy and very, very goal-oriented narcissism and very cold-blooded, the sociopath has a tell, and it is these mood swings, this anger, this rage that's going to be identifiable. The psychopath is like the shark under the water that you don't see coming. And if anything, if there's any good news in all of this, it once again, it is the fact that the sociopath is much more identifiable, and also the fact that psychopaths, because they are born that way, are much more rare. Psychopaths, less than 1% of the U.S. population, adult population, would be psychopathic in nature. And also the good news is twofold. One, serial killers account for less than 1% of all the homicides in the United States, despite all the attention they get and podcasts and books and movies and everything that would make you think it's probably 75% of all murders are committed by serial killers. No, it's less than 1%. And also, less than 1% of all psychopaths and sociopaths become serial killers. So the good news there is it's extremely rare. At any given time in the U.S. population, there's a couple thousand people out there who may have the proclivity and the perfect storm to become a serial killer, but very, very few do.
So this is actually a really good point in terms of one of two of the kind of like psychological aspects I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on, where since a lot of the media is kind of focused at that 1% of the 1%, and maybe a lot of the population now thinks that they're much bigger populations of either serial killers, and then just even maybe much bigger population of different sorts of violent crime in general, and because that's what the media and social media is picked up by the algorithm. I just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts, because I think that kind of driving of that 1% of the 1%, or, just small population, and folks thinking it's bigger than it actually is probably a cause for some of the more political reactionary kind of things that you could see from folks, where they do think that a certain area is infested with crime or murderers or things like that, and they kind of put their political ballot on thinking that's how the way the world is. So I kind of wanted to just hear your thoughts, and I don't know if there's just ways to address or redress that, but just wanted to hear your thoughts as well.
Sure. Well, I don't think that serial killers have been politicized to such an extent to try to affect policy and regulation. But certainly, I think that in the drug wars and in even just the homicide in general, rape, aggravated assault, these things do become politicized. If you're a prosecutor running for re-election, then you want the public to believe that crime is way down, right? But if you are a police chief and you need more resources and you want more money from the city, or if you're the state police and you want more money from the state, then you're going to say crime is rampant. We have these terrible gangs selling drugs everywhere and killing everyone. We need more money. We need more resources. So yeah, it's agenda setting, and it's who the risk holder is. What do you want? What's your goal? And you can use the statistics to your advantage, and people do. I had an interesting thing happen to me. I think you'll enjoy this. A television network that will remain unnamed approached me a couple days ago and said, would you come on and tell the American public how wonderful our president is doing in fighting crime, and how everything is down, and America is a much safer place than it was. And I said, no, thank you. Because while the latest crime rates are down, it does show a reduction. Guess what? That's been part of a trend now for several years. So if you decontextualize it and you say, oh, in the last year, look, crime has gone down. Yeah, but guess what? There's been a downward spiral ever since the pandemic. So crime spiked during the pandemic, and then since then there's been a steady decline. So that's a perfect example of using crime statistics to make a political appeal, and basically propaganda.
Oh, propaganda. Speaking of media and propaganda, you have another book called Mass Deception, if I have that right. And I'm just going to reference this here. You developed your critical communication theory, and you were talking about how leaders and news media create these moral panics, and how that feeds into, feeding into each other, perhaps at our expense. How do we recognize that? It's like, what can we do?
It's a great question. And first of all, I think we should probably explain what a moral panic is. A moral panic is a situation where some group becomes identified as, and the term in terms of the theory, Stanley Cohen, who developed this theory, he called them folk devils. And so it's an individual that has become demonized in the media and by politicians as being responsible for some terrible behavior and some ill in society. And it becomes a moral panic when the rhetoric and the media attention to it and the demonization of it, combined with the official response, the policy response, the regulation, the crackdown, the laws, are far greater than the objective threat that this group poses or the condition poses. Classic example from history would be the witches in Salem, right? It didn't matter that women weren't flying around on broomsticks and turning people into whatever, and responsible for death. It didn't matter because public believed that they were. And so the truth, the reality is based upon the consequences. And that is a classic moral panic, because these women were killed, they were burned at the stake, they were stoned for this alleged behavior that was completely mythical. I applied this same concept to the build-up to the war in Iraq in 2005. That's what my doctoral dissertation was about, and it later became that book, Mass Deception. What I noticed when I was sitting there at the University of Miami just after 2001 is how, for some strange reason, the President of the United States, George W. Bush, began to fixate on Iraq, and the drumbeat over several years just got louder and louder. Weapons of mass destruction, massive stockpiles of the worst weapons of war known to man. We must stamp them out. We must we must go in there now. And to me, it seemed like a classic moral panic, because nothing was going on, and there was no evidence to indicate that there was any real threat. So what I did is I did a regression analysis to show that certain words like evildoers, mad dogs, weapons of mass destruction, the rhetoric, the specific rhetoric of the administration, as that got louder and louder, public opinion, approval of attacking Iraq, going into Iraq and removing Saddam Hussein from power, it went from almost nothing after 9/11 to 80% by the time they launched the war in 2003. So that's a classic case of what's called elite engineered moral panic, where you create a threat, as bogus as it might be, and then you use the media and political rhetoric to just hammer the public until it becomes reality.
You see some of these moral panics, and I think probably the response mechanism for folks to be like, no, this is or is not true, and try to show and prove, is faster and more efficient than ever before. But I don't think that's necessarily helping, because people could be like, oh, that's AI, or are you really American, or things like that. So I'm curious, it could be in terms of solution, it could be just even going against some of the premises I kind of brought up there. But I'd love to hear now, when you're thinking about like moral panics of today with today's technology, if you see anything to either help or any differences. I just wanted to give you a platform and talk about that.
Yeah.
Signs of hope.
Yeah, that could be, please,
Exactly.
please. A sliver.
So where is the hope in all
silver.
of this, right? Yeah, right, exactly. And I do understand your question. Again, I don't see serial killers as being indicative of any sort of a moral panic. The reduction in the number of serial killers, as we've already discussed, is due more to technology, education, psychology, just and scientific tools. The thing about a moral panic, and the thing that makes it so dangerous, is that the risk doesn't even really have to exist. I can say, I know this guy Sean, and he is, perpetrating some terrible thing. And if I can get the media to buy into that, and I can get the legislature to buy into it as well, guess what? You're going to become the latest folk devil, whether you like it or not, and whether you really have done
Earn it,
anything.
steak.
So that's the scary thing about a moral panic. It doesn't even have to exist. Like I said, the witches, I don't think there was anybody flying around in broomsticks up there in Salem, at the time. But the reality of it was these women were getting burned, boiled, and stoned. And so did it matter in an objective, realistic way that they weren't doing anything? No, they were just as dead, so the reality is in the consequences. And this kind of the scary thing is too, is if we've, and I'm going to try to be as, apolitical as possible here, but over the last couple of days, the shootings, Minneapolis and Portland, there are two very distinct stories and interpretations of what happened that almost it's not even the same reality. It's like alternate realities, and yet you have many people who believe one reality and many people who believe the other reality, and this is all driven through the media and social media included, and it's also reinforced by people with clout and political influence who are putting their stamp of approval on the interpretation of the the narrative, which narrative it is. So I wouldn't call what's happening right now, a moral panic, but nevertheless, you can see the power of it. You can see, absolutely the power of it, and there are people who are adamant on both sides of the discussion. And I think personally, that the videos, there's ample video of what happened in Minneapolis. I think it's, to me, I'm fairly clear on the narrative of what happened, but other people see it in a very opposite way. So
it's so interesting. I feel like because it's such a politically charged, and for listeners, this is January 2026. We're talking about ICE-involved shootings of citizens, or what's the correct word I'm looking for? People.
Civilians.
Civilians. Thank you. And I'm thinking about, and I live in Portland, so we have, there's an extra flavor of what narrative I might see through. But when we look at certain cases, like OJ, going back to OJ Simpson, I think there was at the time there was a narrative that the one that please don't be guilty, OJ. And then as time went on, that seemed to shift, where he even came out with a book saying, if I did it, come on, with all the details. And the perception seems to shift overall toward that case. Do you think that will happen in America? Will we start, I don't know, even coming together on the types of story we see, or will a divide continue to increase?
Well, I wish I was a little more optimistic than I actually am. I don't see things going in a very good direction in this country in terms of the separation, of sides. To me, it seems to be getting, more stark. And so, I like I said, I wish I could be a little more optimistic than I am. In terms of the OJ case, it also became very racialized. There was a divide there along racial lines, and that became, of course, very inflammatory and very, very divisive. And it was done on purpose. And the fascinating thing about the OJ case is, despite all of the evidence that would indicate that this guy was, completely guilty, he was exonerated and, found not guilty. And but we get to another truth about the criminal justice system, and I'm a believer in this, is that you get the brand of justice, the quality of justice that you can afford. And he was a black man, but yet he could afford the dream team, the best defense attorneys in the United States that money could buy. And guess what? He bought himself a not guilty verdict. And so, you have to feel for the poor schmuck who may not be guilty but is charged of a serious crime but can't afford a decent lawyer. Are you really on an even playing field? Are you really on an even playing field? Because obviously the prosecutor has far more resources than a public defender that is assigned to the case. But then, if you can afford the dream team, you tip the balance in the other direction. So again, I think maybe my a little bit of my cynicism is showing here today, but I do believe that to a certain extent, justice is for sale.
You got to get the Kardashian on your team, apparently, whether it's for law or for social media.
I'm sorry. I'm bringing a little bit of rain to the parade today.
Oh, but it's the truth.
But it's we have to be honest, right? We have to be honest about these things. And I've seen it. I've worked in the news. I've worked in the entertainment field. I've seen how decisions are made. I've been in the justice system. I've worked with law enforcement. I've done research. I've talked to serial killers. I've been all over on various sides of all of this. And let's face it, it's called agenda setting, particularly in the news media. Agenda setting. A story is told. Well, first of all, a story does not become news because it inherently is newsworthy. It becomes news because someone who is running that news operation has an interest in it, has an interest in making it news. Now, what flavor are we going to serve it up? How are we going to serve it up? And that gets to agenda setting. The tone of the story, how it's presented, depends upon who is in charge, right? Which is why if you look at one story that's being told on, say, Fox News versus the very same story on CNN, you are going to believe that you live in two different worlds, two completely different worlds.
I'm wondering how many world leaders are psychopaths. It'd probably be a lot easier if you had nuclear power, if you didn't really feel bad what happened. And then also, I know there's a disproportionate amount of psychopaths, or at least from that book, the Psychopath Test, which is a fun book, in leadership positions, right?
Are you familiar with Kevin Dutton's work? Yeah, Kevin Dutton is a very dear friend of mine over in the UK, and he only studies the successful, pro-social, acceptable psychopaths, whereas I study the not socially acceptable psychopaths. And he has found that there are a disproportionate number of psychopaths in very high-level, high authoritative positions, and also positions where there is tremendous stress and pressure, like among neurosurgeons, things like that. Politicians, of course, that's almost like a cliche, they're psychopaths, but it is true. There are very, very highly successful psychopaths in government as well as in business. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. If you are goal-oriented, you want to be successful, and you don't care who you hurt along the way to get there, that's a recipe for success.
Yeah, the American dream.
I'm just a bundle of good news here, aren't I?
No.
But do you want to know, it's like, because you spend so much time with this material and these stories and looking at the dark side, how do you keep your own mental space healthy and clear? And what advice would you give to the rest of us who maybe have a leaky gate, or that we're feeling down by the information coming in?
It's a great question. And, at one level, we have to recognize that we don't have the magic wand and have the control to make the change, and so you have to, at one hand, you have to accept reality for what it is. You may disagree with it, but you have to accept it for what it is if you want to sleep at night, and I know many people who allow politics, who allow things to just destroy their lives, and they end up doing drugs and drinking and acting out in all sorts of ways to try to find comfort, and it's all because they're unable to accept reality as it is. So I'm not saying be a pushover, be a doormat. I'm simply saying, I'm talking about accepting reality for what it is. And then on the other hand, I recommend objectivity. Look for sources of information that are as objective as possible. And it's usually alternative sources of information. And because if you look, if you turn on many of the mainstream news sources, again, you're going to get an altered, reality through a rose-colored glasses that reflects someone's point of view, that reflects someone's agenda. So be careful, and always, and especially with things like statistics, when people start throwing statistics at you, who paid for those statistics? Who has a vested interest in that research? And, in back in the 1960s, the U.S. government was doing research that showed that cigarettes are very, very bad for your health. But the cigarette companies had their own research, alternatively saying, smoke up. It's better for you. You're going to be more healthy if you smoke Marlboros. So who has a vested interest in the research that's being used to support a particular claim or a particular point of view? So yeah, look for objectivity, and just don't be swayed by grandiose statements and opinions. I don't know if that's how useful that is, but that's what I try to do. I always, when I hear ironclad statements like this is absolutely true, or this is a terrible problem. Okay, well, who says so? What's the evidence? What's the real scientific evidence to indicate that we have a problem?
What's the evidence and who paid for it?
That's right.
Scott, how can people find you, assuming you'd like to be found, which I know you have the one-man show, which I would love to see, and anything else you'd like to promote?
Well, I'm pretty active in social media, Instagram in particular, and I'm at DocBonn25, DocBonn 25 on Instagram. And my website is docbonn.com, DocBonn.com. And there you can find out, more information about my work, my books. But you did mention the speaking tour, the national speaking tour that I'm about to enter a new leg of. Just next week, I'm going to be headed to California. Monterey, California is the first show next week. And so my tour, it's Serial Killers with Dr. Scott Bonn, and it's a 2-hour event where I take people inside the minds of some of the most diabolical serial killers of all time, much of it based upon my own experiences, my own interactions, my own discourse with these individuals. And to see the calendar, the cities, the dates, and links for tickets and more information are all available there on my website at docbonn.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I will not be sleeping well tonight, and I appreciate that.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, sir.
I've come to talk with you again. Come and be inside my head. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. It's only a matter of time till we all win. Cancel good to say. It's only a matter of time till we all win. Cancel good to say. It's only a matter of time till we all win. Cancel good to say. Cancel me. Cancel me. Cancel me. I got things to say. You can cancel me. Cancel me. Cancel me. I got things to say. You can cancel me. Cancel me. Cancel me. I got things to say. You can cancel me.